People have said that Paul McCartney finally spoke out about the breakup of the Beatles after years of silence. For a long time about who was to blame, John Lennon, Yoko Ono, Harrison, George, Ringo Starr, or even Paul, fans have come up with ideas that blame others based on old interviews, songs, and rumors. The Beatles were the biggest band in the world, and when they split in 1970 it broke hearts everywhere. For decades Paul stayed diplomatic, dropping hints but never giving a straight answer. Now in a new interview he's decided to set the record straight and tell his side of the story. It all started back in the 1960s. The Beatles were unstoppable, hit after hit, sold out shows and fans screaming wherever they went. Paul, John, George and Ringo were like brothers, creating music that changed the world, but by the late 60s things started to crack. They weren't getting along anymore. Money problems, creative fights, and personal lives got in the way. Paul says it wasn't just one person or one moment that ended it. It was a slow build-up, like a pot boiling over. Paul remembers the early days when everything was fun. They write songs in hotel rooms, laughing and bouncing ideas around. John and Paul were the main songwriters and their partnership was magic. But as time went on, John started pulling away. Paul says John was restless, wanting to try new things outside the band. Then Yoko came into the picture. A lot of fans blamed her, saying she took John away from the Beatles. Paul says it was hard when Yoko started coming to rehearsals. The band had always been just the four of them, with no boyfriends or outsiders. All of a sudden, John wanted Yoko to be there all the time, which changed the mood. Paul doesn't blame Yoko for everything, but he does say that John was already moving before she got there. John was sick of being a Beatle and the stress. Paul believes that John wanted freedom and that Yoko just pushed him in that direction. I think Paul was losing his best friend. They would fight more over songs about the band's direction. George was also angry because he had good ideas, but Paul and John often shot them down. George stayed quiet but is getting angry. Paul now realizes that he could have paid more attention and given George a bigger part. Then there was the business side. When their manager Brian Epstein died in 1967, things got messy, and they didn't know who to trust. Paul pushed for Lee Eastman, his father-in-law, to take over John. George and Ringo didn't like that idea. They thought Paul was trying to take over. Instead, they hired Alan Clean, a tough New York boss. Paul didn't like Clean at first. He thought Clean was shady and more interested in money than music. The band split into two groups. Paul on one side and Clean on the other. The fight over management was a big hole in the foundation. Paul says he tried to keep things together by pushing for new projects like the Let It Be album and film, but the others weren't interested anymore. John would show up later or not at all. George would walk out during recording and almost quit for good, and Ringo felt stuck in the middle. Paul admits he could be bossy back then because he didn't want the Beatles to fall apart. Looking back, he wonders if he pushed too hard and the others felt smothered, or if he didn't see how unhappy they were. The breaking point came in 1969, when John told Paul he was leaving the band. It wasn't a big deal. Paul was shocked and begged John to stay to work things out, but John wouldn't budge and said the Beatles were over for him. Paul was hurt and mad, but he didn't want to let go. For months, they didn't tell anyone that the band was still recording. Abby Radcliffe pretended everything was fine, but on the inside, it was over. Paul says that's when he realized that the Beatles broke up, not just one person, but all of them. After John left, Paul didn't know what to do, so he went home to Scotland and hid from the world by drinking too much. He felt lost without the band. The others moved on, and John married Yoko Ono. When George released his solo work, Ringo started acting, and Paul was the last to accept it. Then, in 1970, he made it official by releasing his first solo album, McCartney, and telling the press that the Beatles were over. Fans were furious because they thought Paul ended it because he spoke out first. He says that's not true. John quit before Paul made it public. Some said it changed the story. Yoko mindwashed John and others said Paul had too much power. Fans of George said he was overlooked. Fans of Ringo just wanted To get along with everyone, Paul didn't say anything about the rumors because he loved the Beatles too much to say bad things about them in public. But now he's sick of the lies and says the real reason for the breakup wasn't anyone's fault, but a mix of egos, exhaustion, and bad timing. They were young guys under a lot of pressure and they couldn't handle it forever. After the breakup, Paul thinks about John a lot. They had some rough years with too many people and jabs in songs like How Do You Sleep, but they got back together before JN died in 1980. Paul is glad that he wants to miss John, misses the good times they had together and wishes he had told George more how much he cared about him. George died in 2001. They still hang out with Ringo and are good friends. Since the Beatles were like a family, Paul says that the breakup hurts but doesn't erase the love when you look back. Paul knows he could have been less stubborn and more open to other people's ideas, but he doesn't think he's the bad guy. John wanted George to leave because he was tired of the fights. They all did their part, and Ringo got stuck in the middle. Paul wants his fans to stop blaming others. Maybe the fact that the Beatles gave the world so much is what means most to him. He's proud of what they did, even if things got messy in the end. Paul is happy about it. He's 82 and still making songs. Still traveling, he wants people to know the truth about the band's breakup, not to blame anyone, but to understand that it was a slow process of friends losing touch with each other. There's more to life than drama. Paul is finally okay with sharing that story, which shows the world the real Beatles. Flaws and all. Paul has been thinking about this for a long time. He didn't want to talk about everything right after the breakup because his emotions were still too raw. He focused on his new band, raised his kids, and avoided questions about the Beatles by giving vague answers. Reporters would push him, fans would beg him, "I'll just smile and say it's all in the past." On the inside, he was still figuring it out, and he'd play back those last few years in his head, wondering what went wrong. One big moment stands out, the Let It Be sessions. They were filming everything to show how the Beatles worked, but all they caught was the tension. Paul remembers pushing the band to keep going, even when they were falling apart. He'd suggest ideas like playing live on a rooftop, but they weren't excited. John was distracted, and George was grumpy. Ringo just went along with it, and that 1969 show on a balcony was their last. Paul loved it, but he knew it was ending. He also thinks a lot about Alan Klein. Paul still thinks Klein is in trouble. He would tell the others to show them the numbers and point out deals that were sketchy. They wouldn't listen. John liked Klein's tough guy act, and George and Ringo followed John. Paul felt alone and like he was losing when he refused to sign with Klein. It made things worse. The band broke up over trust as well as music. Paul says that was a dagger in the heart of the Beatles. John's departure hit Paul hard. They'd been through so much together, writing She Loves You in a tiny room, conquering America, and crazy tours. In that chaos, Paul wrote Let It Be because he felt like he was losing a piece of himself. At the time, he didn't know that John was already gone in his mind when John finally said it out loud. John was over after the breakup, and Paul didn't want to accept it because he thought they could get back together like they always did. Paul watched as John and Yoko made headlines with their protests, weird albums, and peace campaigns. George proved he had a lot to say with All Things Must Pass. Ringo, on the other hand, kept things light by making fun movies and songs. Paul felt like he had to be the best. His first record, Simple Homemade, wasn't well received by critics or fans. He took it personally because he wanted to show that he didn't need the Beatles, but he missed them. The public breakup in 1970 was a mess. Paul's press release came with his album. In it, he answered questions like, "Are you planning to work with the Beatles again?" No one read it, and crazy headlines said Paul quit. Paul says he didn't. He just told the truth after John had already left, which made him the fall guy. After the fact, John joked, "Paul didn't break up the Beatles, I did, but the damage was already done." Paul held that grudge for a long time. He didn't say a word in the 1970s and 1980s because John's death made him feel bad. They only recently started talking again. Short chats, nothing serious. Paul wants more time with them. George's pass hit too.